Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Sally Blair, Senior Director for Fellowship Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. On behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I am pleased to welcome you to today's presentation, Iraqi Kurdistan at the Crossroads, a report on civil society, featuring Reagan Fassell Democracy Fellow Nawaf Haskan. We are delighted to have with us as a discussion Sherazan Minwala, practitioner in residence at the Washington College of Law in the International Human Rights Clinic at American University. Funded by the U.S. Congress, the Reagan Fassell Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at NED. Now celebrating our 15th anniversary year, we have hosted more than 250 fellows from over 90 countries since our founding in 2001. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for his unwavering commitment to democracy in Iraq. With a referendum on independence in speculation for autumn 2017, Iraqi Kurdistan stands at a crucial political juncture that has global implications. The increasing autonomy of the region promises to have a significant impact on long-standing international efforts to stabilize Iraqi democratic institutions and attitudes. U.S. security policy, which relies on Kurdish forces in Iraq and Syria as vital allies in the fight against ISIL, may also be affected. Amid these high stakes, it is yet unclear whether civil society in the region is sufficiently independent and democratically minded to facilitate crucial social dialogue about the political future of Iraqi Kurdistan. In his presentation today, journalist and political commentator Nawaf Haskan will draw on his experiences with Kurdish civil society to trace its evolution from 2003 to the upcoming independence referendum. Reporting on the state of civil society in Iraqi Kurdistan, he will offer recommendations for how domestic and international actors can most effectively facilitate positive change. Nawaf is a Yazidi journalist from Iraq currently based in the DC area, where he worked as a cultural advisor and translator for Riot, R-Y-O-T, and the Huffington Post. From 2015 to 2016, he served as a business development officer for the International Organization for Migration. Before graduating from the American University of Iraq, Suleimani, he founded several youth-based civic education initiatives in the Sinjar district of Nanua province, where he sought to strengthen the principles of pluralism through regular workshops in local villages. As a journalist, he has discussed issues related to sectarian conflict and democratization in several major and local news outlets, including Public Radio International, Iraqi 1001 Thoughts, Iraq Oil Report, and Nikash. During his fellowship here at NED, he has been working to develop methods of teaching Iraqis about the rights and responsibilities of democratic citizenship and providing a forum for independent reporting on issues vital to civic engagement. Sherazan Minwala is a practitioner in residence at the Washington College of Law in the International Human Rights Clinic at the American University. Professor Minwala is an experienced human rights lawyer who advocates for survivors of gender-based violence in the U.S. and the Middle East. She has spent much of the last decade living in Iraq, where she has run human rights, development, and humanitarian programs with Heartland Alliance International, the International Rescue Committee, and Mercy Corps. Welcome. We will now turn the floor over to Nawaf, who will speak for approximately 25 minutes, followed by Sherazan for 10 minutes. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at Any Democracy. If you have not already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members involved with this event, and most especially Research Associate Ian Graham, who has offered vital assistance to the fellowship project and today's presentation. Thank you. Nawaf.
I would like to welcome everybody today to my presentation on the civil society in Iraqi Kurdistan. And I will also give a thank to Sally Blair and Ian Graham for their assistance, and the rest of the Regan Fassel and NED staff for giving me this opportunity actually to do this presentation during my fellowship here. So in today's presentation, I will introduce you to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I will also give a brief background of myself and my involvement with civil society. I will look at the current strengths of the civil society in Iraqi Kurdistan and the challenges it faces, and finally we will end the presentation by giving what opportunities are there, and giving some recommendation for both local and international organizations that work in Kurdistan region. Iraqi Kurdistan is a part of a greater Kurdistan. Some of you may be very familiar with that. As you see here, we have 4 parts of Kurdistan. You have the Rojhelat, which is the Iranian Kurdistan. And then you have then we have the Bakur, which is here is the Turkish Kurdistan. Then you have the Rojava, which recently become the topic in the most of the news, the Syrian Kurdistan. And here the white area here is the Bashur Kurdistan. Overall population of the Kurdish populations around 30 million in over the greater Kurdistan. Only about 5 million of them live in Iraqi Kurdistan. So by looking at this map, here we see the Iraqi Kurdistan, which has been a de facto state, a semi-independent state since 1991. If we look at this entity here, it's look more like of a one unified entity, but actually it's more of a diverse region in terms of culture, language, and religion. In terms of religion, you have Muslim, Sunni, Shi'i, other minorities, Yazidis, Christians, Zoroastrians, and in terms of language, you have this area, the Sulaimani area, called Soran area, the people who speak more of like the Soran dialect of Kurdish, and the rest of the areas mostly speak the Badini dialect of Kurdish. You have Erbil as a capital. It's almost a unified entity in terms of politics. They have their own parliamentary, they have their own government. It's 111 MP in the parliamentary, divided mainly between 3 Kurdish political parties. In Sulaimania, you have PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, and recently, for a decade, Goran has been around the change movement. And here in this area, you have mainly KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party. In Sulaimania, it's more toward to Iran cultures, more, they call it the capital culture of Kurdistan, or more like open and liberal. If you go farther north, you will be like ended up in more like tribal and conservative areas here. Not to forget, there have been recent conflict between the both parties over controlling the Kurdistan. This back to 1990s, where there had been a deadly fight between both areas. In addition to what I discussed here, the orange area here, what we just talked about, but Iraqi Kurdistan has claimed that this striped area here is belong to Kurdistan as a state. Somehow the central government of Iraq actually disagree with that, and they claim it's a part of Iraq. then these areas being left as the disputed territories between both governments since 2003. And that area has been also left as a like undeserved area by both governments. Then when we come to the independence of Kurdistan, it's been a crucial topic, an important topic today, just looking at the news outlets. There is more than, I would say, 10 articles about the independence and the new referendums coming, which will be held in September 25th of this year. Even though the Kurdistan being a de facto state and semi-independent state, but the Kurdistan government is looking forward to hold a referendum on the national independence of that state. Here I will argue here about the role of civil society, where the role of civil society comes. And I think it's very crucial here, the role of civil society, to explain to people what independence means for a Kurdish state, what referendum means, what's the implications, and what the issues with the referendum. And it must explain to the people, the citizens put in a political process, and also seek to explain what kind of Kurdish state will be for the Iraqi Kurd. By the time that there was a de facto state, actually I was a little boy around there where I lived in the disputed territory of Sinjar, where I just took the striped line there. Growing up on a farm and going to an Arabic school, because at that time Kurdish school were not allowed, it's more like the Arabization idea of the area. I never counted for 16 years in a school, neither in curriculum, neither in speech or public. I never counted the idea of civil society under Saddam. And then that's what grew up. And then it comes to this moment where things were changed, a lot of things with the intervention of US troops. And then I had the opportunity to be a part of that kind of liberation, to work as an interpreter for US troops. Many things have shaped my mind since then. After I left working with for US troops, I went back to finish my school and to study at the Mosul University, but my safety was jeopardized because as both a former interpreter for US troops as an Yazidi from Sinjar. So it was that time when I found out there is something else we can express ourselves as a youth. So I started with some youth groups to find a capacity building center where we discuss, the idea of civic education, the things related to democracy, and these things. Like I saw there is a hunger for something else beyond what's taught in the curriculums at the public school. Between this year in 2010, I had the opportunity to go to American University, being awarded a scholarship there. And in 2015, I graduated as a top student, a valedictorian of my class, majored in business and minored in journalism. Oh, it's okay. Yeah, maybe there's. So actually, the big moment in my life and the change happened in that moment, in this year, in 2004, on 3rd of August, when ISIS actually attacked my hometown. And that's what happened when they attacked. They killed thousands of people, around 7,000 of people were being the victim. 5,000 children and women were held in captivity. Women were being raped, and all this story will come out of this attempted genocide on the Yazidi population. And here we ended up in Iraqi Kurdistan. What ISIS left behind, so this was my farm before ISIS came, and this is what happened to it. And here were the school I went to and my village, Khanasor, and then today it's like that. This is what ISIS left behind. And this is put my people like me, youth like me, with some skills and being educated in America, with difficult question: what should we do? And then it was for me, it was an opportunity to use my skills to reach the message what happened to my people and what happened to the region. It was that time when I involved in the journalism things. In 2016, I was given the special immigrant visa to come to US, and as most of you would do here in Washington, D.C., first thing I did, we went to for protest. And actually, this was the second anniversary of what happened to my hometown. I still asking people for more attention. And here, when I heard also, it's also affected me that where the ban, the executive order was signed to ban 7 countries, many of my friends and my wife was affected by this. I personally affected. They were held in airports. So at that time, I felt there is something we do. With some help of some amazing veterans and civil society organization, we formed a group, we visit Capitol Hill, and actually that came up with some very good impacts, especially for Iraq. Then I was awarded the fellowship with NED. I've been a part of this amazing group of fellows from different countries who are mainly focused on like civil society activities. Here at NED, I thought I should do something that related to where the area I came from and combine what's going on there. And I saw the civil society thing is very interesting for me since I've been experienced and involved in here and there. So when I decided to focus on civil society, I took Kurdistan. So let's see what kind of civil society exists. I found that actually a civil society exists, not just like, for example, if you compare to Saudi Arabia or Turkmenistan or these areas where no civil society. And I found this number. I found around 2,850 civil society, mainly NGOs, actually exist in that area. In all over Iraq, 7,000. This is like almost half of what happened. And most of these civil society are local organizations, which was very interesting to me. So I had the interest to dig it deeply to see what's the strength of the civil society. Actually, I should just tell you, civil society in Kurdistan region has not exist that much before 1991. It was that time where they give the time to organization to folks. And between 1991, 2003, there were almost like 300 civil society organizations. But now this number is very incredible compared to the number of the people and the region. What I found is these civil society, they have good a great diverse of their work. One of the things they focusing on the humanitarian response. There are a lot of humanitarian response. Supporting vulnerable groups like IDPs, displacement people, refugees and women and other people. They give a lot of part of their mission to the medical, psychological, and legal assistance, shelter infrastructure, water and sanitation also being a part of the civil society activity around. Human rights, like including violence, especially after 2014. The other thing I found that there was one of the best law in Middle East exists in this area. This law was passed after another law was passed in Iraq in 2010. And this law gives the civil society organization these 5 good points: simplifying the registration, and creating condition of like financial sustainability, and less restrictions on the civil society, especially if somebody, a foreigner in Kurdistan, want to be on the board of one of these civil society organizations. When it comes to the criminal penalties, there is a remove on that. Also, greater transparency when the civil society organization will be awarded based on their, awarded, not given the grants or funding. At the same, even though there was strengths, I found there's also some challenges with civil society organization. And then one of the challenges, competitor for resources. And there here I found some evidence of that. And then implementing the right law. Still civil society in Iraq face that problem of implementing the right law. I found a problem with independent of civil society, and still, according to USAID record, there is still about 60% of civil society in Iraqi Kurdistan is not independent. And there are main reasons, like even though there is law exists for the registration, the simplify, there is still a requirement, a lot, limited kind of requirement that limit the freedom of pressure from political parties, also political parties affiliation, and accountability within civil society when the key person in the civil society make all the decision, and then this come to the idea of nepotism and other things. With that, there is also I found there are other things that very sensitive for civil society to touch. Corruption, government and election, and that happened in 2014 when many organizations, civil society, withdraw for even monitoring the election because of the political mess there. Also, media and free speech. There is also civil society avoid touching that topic because some of the media people been arrested. Advocacy work. Also, there's some civil society organization, they will avoid it because it's kind of the risky area where they found themselves. Some anticipated crises also affect civil society in Kurdistan. Security, the things happen all around, even though Kurdistan has safe haven compared to the rest of Iraq. So security was a big issue. A wave of IDPs and refugees come to Kurdistan, and civil society organizations were not prepared to take care of them. Economic slum, that's a big thing when the huge number of unemployment, especially civil society organizations were funded by government, now they are competing with the rest of organizations for international grants. Then I would like to give what opportunities are there. For local civil society, I think they have the opportunity and the recommendation, they have the opportunity to work on more grants. If they do the followings, improve their organizational structure, foster trust and balance between themselves, the government, and the people, establish a clear goal or focus. That's what most of the international civil society blame the locals for not having a clear goal or focus. Address youth. Many youth see a civil society organization is a way to be engagement with the society. Promote coordination, collaboration, both between civil society organization and government and civil society organization themselves. Things like that should happen more. There's initiatives, but there should be more initiatives around this area. Also for international organization, there is a capacity building programs exist, but there should be more involvement and support for these kind of programs. Utilize micro. You just don't pour a lot of money there to be overwhelmed by this money, and they don't know what to do, the local organization. Encourage local, that's to hone the focus of their goal or make a clear goal. Emphasize civic education, what I think there is a gap even in whole Iraq and Kurdistan. And then support the civil society beyond the technical. It's not about writing a proposal, creating website. You have to be transparent and you have to be independent to meet the standards of international civil society organization. Connect the civil society in diaspora, like for example, in Kurdistan and rest of the civil society in rest, like in DC, and even in Iraq, like in Basra and Baghdad. And I give the credit to one of the organizations already supported by NED, actually, doing something like that, the EPIC. Finally, I want to say it's a time for civil society organization, local civil society, to improve that they can do something. Because there is the idea of a referendum, the independence, it's very crucial for them to take a step in that and explain to people what is going on there. I would like to thank you so much.
Thank you, Nawaf, for an excellent, thoughtful, and very moving insight into what you and your people and your region has gone through. We are very proud to welcome you and your wife here to NED and to be supporting your work moving forward.
Thank you.
So I'll now turn the floor over to Sherazan for some comments and to provide her own perspective, perhaps on some of the work to do with women in Iraq. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And I would like to can you hear me? Okay. I would like to commend Nawaf and congratulate him for what I think was, an excellent presentation and overview of civil society in the Kurdistan region.
Thank you.
And he's really put a lot of work into this, and it shows. I met Nawaf about 4 years ago in Suleimania, and I had the benefit of attending his graduation and listening to him give his speech. And I have to say it was incredibly impressive, not only because the speech was fantastic, but because he was part of a community that was undergoing an incredibly difficult time. And so to have gone through that and then to still graduate at the top of your class really says something, I think, about him as a person, about his integrity and his intelligence and his ability. So I have huge expectations for Nawaf going forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
So this is really, it's a pivotal time, right? So we're heading into this referendum, and Nawaf has asked me to sort of expand more to talk about what's going on around civil society and work on women's issues, gender, violence against women, gender equality. I think that's important for two reasons. One, I think Nawaf recognizes that the role of women in the society is important. The work that they're doing is critical towards a stable and well-functioning democracy, and also because that's been the focus of my work over the last more than 10 years in the Kurdistan region, 8 of those living there. So one thing that I just want to mention that I think is really important is that there is a really good operating environment in the Kurdistan region right now for civil society. It's a very vibrant, active civil society. There are a lot of different kinds of activities going on. And when you look at the issue of gender and the work around women's issues, there is support at the highest levels of the government. So I think that really provides a space in which people can challenge a lot of what's going on and can really sort of push an agenda that has been very difficult. I will say that I think that operating environment exists in large part because civil society has pushed the boundaries. So if you look at what the situation was, say, in the mid-90s, we have a very different situation where people are talking about issues and doing work that, you didn't really see 20, 25 years ago. And so there's sort of a real sort of assertion of civil society and I think impact, and then also a positive response from the government. And so one thing that I just want to, and I'll keep my remarks brief because there's a lot that I could say and there are a lot of interesting issues, but I'm just going to try and keep my remarks brief so we can open this up for a Q&A period. But what I just want to talk about briefly is what some of the work is that women's organizations are doing, and not just women's organizations, but civil society organizations, which are very active, not only involving women, and it is a very active space for Kurdish women to work, but also a lot of men are engaged in working on issues around gender. And I think that's a very positive thing. So women, civil society organizations focusing on gender issues are really sort of contributing to a public discourse and dialogue about these issues. They are advocating for legislative and policy changes. They are providing services that would not be otherwise provided to the population. And they're engaging in a lot of awareness-raising activities in different communities around the Kurdistan region with local populations about women's rights, about gender issues, about protection, about services. So it's a very sort of vibrant and dynamic, I think, civil society focusing on these kinds of issues. So expanding on some of the achievements that Nawaf pointed to, I just wanted to point to some of the achievements that we've seen with regard to civil society advocating on women's issues. And so, again, I point to the issue of public dialogue because I think there is a space, and it's still quite difficult, but there is a space in which people are able to talk about really sensitive, difficult issues in a conservative society. So we hear a lot of discourse around FGM, around honor killings, around forced marriage, sometimes around human trafficking, and these are not easy things to talk about. They implicate a lot of issues around honor and shame, and women get a lot of, and civil society actors get a lot of criticism sometimes from different parts of the society for sort of talking openly about these issues, but I think they continue to push those boundaries, and that's a real achievement. And there is, again, there's also, you do sort of see the response from the government in supporting that and also contributing to that dialogue, so I think that's an important achievement. policy and legislative changes. There have been some really key achievements in this area going back to the 90s. Both parties that were sort of running separate administrations at that time changed the law so that you could no longer get a reduced sentence in a case of an honor killing. So under Iraqi law, for example, if you kill under the pretext of honor, you can benefit from a reduced sentence. And that's no longer the case in Kurdistan, and that started back in the 90s. And I think now if you look at the current situation, you will see that there are many more individuals who are being arrested, prosecuted, and given pretty long sentences, life sentences in many cases, for killing women, even under the pretext of honor. So that's a huge achievement. Some other changes we've seen, there were some significant changes to the personal status law in 2008. For example, that led to greater restrictions around polygamy, which was a big issue for civil society actors. There is a family violence bill that was passed in 2009, and also, and Nawaf pointed to this in his slide, FGM has been criminalized, female genital mutilation. So again, those are some significant changes in terms of policy and legislative changes. And then another, I think, positive achievement has just been an improvement in protection. So you now see shelters in every governorate in Kurdistan. And initially, the first shelter that opened in 1999 was opened by an international organization with the support of local civil society. But you do now have local organizations that run shelters, but primarily these are run by the government through the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. So that's not, I don't think that the government would have necessarily taken that initiative on its own, right? Again, I think this is very much a result of civil society advocating to protect women. And even though there are issues with the shelters and even though there's room for improvement, they have saved lives and they continue to save lives. And so that's huge because you don't have one government-run shelter in the rest of Iraq. And so I think that is a big credit to civil society and the government's response in the Kurdistan region. And then also services. So civil society provides a wide range of legal services, psychosocial services, health services to vulnerable populations and victims of human rights abuses. And without civil society and without an active civil society, both local with the support also of international organizations, they're really feeling a huge gap in terms of the need for services. So that's just an overview of what I see as some of the achievements, and I think they're significant. And then I just want to talk about some of the challenges, again, expanding on what Nawaf talked about in his presentation, specifically looking at this from the lens of what we're seeing with civil society organizations working on gender issues. So one, and Nawaf also alluded to this, one important issue is that in 2014, there was a major shift, right? So many of the organizations were working on development-focused programs on access to justice, on training, on capacity building, and all of those things. And then suddenly, thousands and thousands of people started flowing into the Kurdistan region, and everything shifted. The donors' priorities shifted. The NGOs had to shift. And myself included, working with an international organization, we didn't all have the skills that were needed to suddenly deal with this urgent situation. So that has been a major challenge, I think. And I have seen, I think because Kurdistan had a pretty well-developed civil society, they were able to make that shift. So that was important. Resources, Nawaf also mentioned scarce resources. There's a lot of competition. This is not unique, of course, to Kurdistan, but there's a lot of competition for funding and resources. And I think sometimes what that can do is sort of detract from what's very much needed in terms of collaboration to really address and challenge issues of violence against women, improving women's rights and protection. There's oftentimes just a lot of competition among local organizations, and sometimes it creates a somewhat toxic environment. And I think that that is definitely something to sort of address and pay attention to. There are a lot of services that are being provided. I would suggest that there's a lot of room for improving the quality of services. There's oftentimes little oversight in terms of how the services are provided. So for example, today you have an incredibly traumatized population living in Kurdistan. A lot of people have PTSD. There are huge needs for mental health and psychosocial support, but there's not a lot of capacity in terms of being able to deliver those services in a way that meets the needs of the population. And that takes time, right? So it doesn't happen overnight. And so there really needs to continue to be investment, I think, in ensuring that the quality of services is there. And whether that oversight comes from the donors, whether it comes from the government or some sort of professional associations, I think is something that hasn't quite been sorted out. And there's a lot of room for sort of figuring those pieces out. The influence of political parties and high-level government officials in the context of working on gender issues, this can have real implications. If perpetrators are well-connected, victims often fear retaliation and don't necessarily report those crimes or prosecute them. And we've definitely come across that. And so also, I think just the question of independence and the influence of the political parties, I think in the context of organizations and civil society working on issues of gender, you see quite a continuum. So, but a lot of these organizations, I think, have really sort of separated in many ways from the direct influence of the parties. And in many cases, they have really gained, if not a lot more independence, a lot more sort of diffused, sort of direct connection back to the political parties in terms of parties being able to directly inform and influence their work. So, especially because a lot of the money is coming from international donors from the global north, they're also accountable to different donors, different organizations, different standards, and so there's a lot of other people who are sort of involved in the day-to-day running of these organizations and how they do their work. I'm sorry if I'm talking too long. I'll just try to wrap this up. So another issue that I see is governance. There are a lot of issues, I think, with how these organizations are governed. In many ways, I think they're a reflection of just the very hierarchical nature of the society, right? So you have very vertically structured governance structures as opposed to sort of a more egalitarian structure within these NGOs. And so, people respect authority, they respect power, and so people are not always empowered to do their work, and it can really sort of impede, I think, confidence of people working in civil society, but also just the ability to be more effective and be more efficient. And then one sort of last issue that I want to point to that Nawaf also mentioned, but I'd like to add to this, is sort of what are some of the red lines? Again, civil society working on gender issues are tackling incredibly difficult issues. I would say I just wanted to add to the sort of corruption piece 3 other areas that I think have been very difficult to work on. And even though some organizations have worked on these issues, they've done so with the backing of international organizations. And they've done so by sort of like self-regulating around certain aspects of them. So there's sort of 3 areas that I wanted to highlight. One is human trafficking. It's a very sensitive issue. We have huge numbers of vulnerable populations in Kurdistan. And so we know trafficking exists. We expect that the problem has expanded given the situation in Kurdistan with all of these displaced people. But it's a sensitive issue, the issue of torture. There are so many people who are being displaced from areas around Mosul, many youth who are being, and young men who are being arrested and detained and questioned around their affiliation with ISIS. How are those confessions being obtained? What kind of evidence is being provided? It's a sensitive issue. Again, it's not unique to Kurdistan, but it's something that I think it's difficult for organizations to sort of address very publicly and work around. And then just the last one is the LGBT population. This is not an issue. I've done work with the LGBT population in Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq. Very sensitive, very difficult to work on, and we have not really seen civil society sort of publicly feel comfortable talking about these issues because of, I think, fear of retaliation and from just the wider society. It's an issue that's not really accepted and sort of easy to deal with. So that, I think, is another red line. So the last sort of just in conclusion, what I want to say is that I think, my impression, at least especially looking at civil society working on these issues, is that they've really changed the landscape considerably. I think overall, when you look at what they've achieved, there's been a very significant impact in terms of contributing to the public dialogue around a lot of these issues, but also filling gaps in services and just changing the agenda and changing the laws and changing policies. So as we head towards the referendum, I think these organizations absolutely have a significant role to contribute, and I think that they're ready to do it. I think that they're very vocal, they're very active. And I would just say that, I guess my last sort of point is that we need to look at the work that is being done on gender and on women's issues, not as something that's sort of out there on the periphery, but something that really impacts all aspects of issues that are of concern in Kurdistan: security, terrorism, just everything. That this is not just an issue that affects women, but it affects the whole society.
Thank you very much. Oh, I don't know what we've done here. Maybe I'll try. Is it okay? Seems a little loud. Thank you very much. Your in-depth knowledge and your commitment is really extraordinary. And thank you for adding this dimension to our conversation. We do now have time for Q&A. We have people with the microphones. If you could identify yourself and also keep your question or comment brief. I will start with this gentleman here in the front row. And just wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation and your commentary. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I'm the president of the Global Policy Institute. A couple of things. One, regarding one of the issues that you've mentioned, of the problems, sort of the underlying issues in Kurdistan as in the region in general, which is corruption, and therefore accountability. I mean, of course, one hears all kinds of stories about corruption, about essentially Kurdistan being a family business, with two families, one in Erbil and the other one in Suleimania. I mean, you know all these things much better than I do. Maybe you can elaborate a little more in the context of how much can civil society's organization impinge on this reality and how deep this reality is. And related to the general context, you mentioned almost in passing the referendum about independence. Now that's a big deal, it seems to me. Maybe you can elaborate a little further about the possible implications, because it seems to me, and I don't know how much this has been thought through, but clearly, an independent Kurdistan changes the geopolitics of the entire region, has ripple effects on the other Kurdish groups that you have outlined, and last but not least, what's going on in Syria where there is a parallel Kurdish issue, although unrelated to the one. Anyway, if you can elaborate on that, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much for your question. Very interesting question. So I will start with the idea of corruption. I mean, so one thing with the corruption, it's not just a sensitive issue in Kurdistan, it's a sensitive issue even here and all over the world. It's more like a global sensitive issue. I found that civil society organization, even if there's like the signs, there should be signs and remark who's corrupted there, but they have a very difficulty to touch that. I mean, they get threats, they get phone calls, things like that happen. I found, personally, I found cases with friends and, colleagues happening to them. So I don't think civil society organization, local civil society organization, can dig more or go deep in that issue without the support of international civil society, like a kind of back support of them to go, to expose a corrupted case or something like that. So that's one, the corruption. And as you said, the idea of a referendum make it, Kurdistan, it is a very important entity geographically, politically in the region. And I think the stabilization of Kurdistan could reflect the stabilization of Iraq and the whole region. Yeah, so as you said, it's a very critical, I would say potential goal they are going toward, but I think it should be addressed in the right way. And it should not be addressed as a political achievement, one of the political party achievement upon them, because we know there are some political parties are disagreeing with what's going on. But then I think civil society could mediate between the two, the opposition and the other political party, of explaining to that thing. In the issue of Syria, I'm not that much familiar with the Syria, because Syria, Kurdistan in Syria, it's a very new and a novice, I would say a kind of a state. And I don't know how much. I will say I will compare the situation to like 1991 in Iraqi Kurdistan. Even they are like maybe they are more active, and then they are more like equality between men and women, things like that. But I mean that's the I would say that's that thing about the Syria. Thank you.
Further questions? Yes, there, this gentleman.
Can you tell us about the differences in participation between Arab IDPs and Kurdish IDPs in these gender-based organizations? And also, if the Arab IDPs are interested in taking up leadership roles in the
That's an interesting question. I think, in my experience, most of the staff working with these organizations tend to be from the local community. So I think, for the most part, the displaced population is largely unemployed and doesn't have as much access to employment, in particular through civil society. Although I would say it sort of depends, because I mean, if civil society is working in the camps, which they often are, then they often do work with displaced population. I think it just sort of depends on, the kind of work that they're doing. But they don't tend to necessarily, I think, reach levels of leadership positions. They might be, doing work at the community level in their own displaced communities and sort of working with organizations in that way. But yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Nawaf, for the great presentation. My name is Juman, and I work at the Commission on International Religious Freedom. I was just wondering if you had any specific challenges you could share about maybe Yazidi CSOs and the work they're doing to help rehabilitate the community that you'd like to share with us. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean that's also interesting in the terms of when it comes to the term. I mean Yazidi, especially we talk about the Yazidi from Sinjar or like Shingal, the Kurdish term, and because of the the politics that going on, the conflicts between PKK, KDP, and now Al-Hashd from the government, there is been a lot of issue, and then any civil society organization want to work in that area, and that issue they've been double screened compared to civil society organization will work in Erbil and Dohuk, and they faced some issues. I personally, I've been like a kind of a consultant administrator for one of the local organizations. We faced kind of double screening. Civil society organization usually would, somebody working in Dohuk would take 1 month to get the permission to work. The organization I'm involved in, we took 3 months to get to get the permission. And I understand this concern about like different affiliating with different political parties and things like that.
Sharon, like to say a few words about the women, Yazidi women, and work that's being done to support them?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, and I think it's an interesting question also. I mean, the idea of having an organization that serves a particular population, right? So a lot of, when you're looking at the work that's being done by civil society around women's issues, they tend to not focus on only a particular ethnic or religious group, right? They'll serve women from Iran if they're threatened, from Baghdad if they're threatened. But one thing that I think you're seeing more and more, especially since 2014, is organizations that are developed by communities that have been targeted only to serve those communities. And so then people are sort of bifurcated and working in isolation and not necessarily working across those different ethnic and religious lines. And I think that that's also just a reflection of maybe a lot of distrust of other communities and feeling like, they're the only ones who can really help their community. But then I think there's also questions around, again, capacity, skills, willingness to sort of be open to sort of how those services are provided. I mean, a number of these Yazidi organizations that have sprung up in response to the crisis, but they're very young and very new. And so, being able to work with other more experienced organizations also has its benefits. And particularly when working with the women who have escaped from ISIS, who are suffering incredible trauma. These women, they really need services that I think do exist also in the broader civil society community, but there are sometimes issues of distrust. So there's a lot of sort of layers of issues that are going on, but you can understand sort of why they emerged and function in that way.
Question back there, yes.
I'm Sam Dinello with the Public International Law and Policy Group. And I'm wondering, one of the challenges that civil society faces is healing from ISIS and processing any militants in custody. So I'm wondering, what role do you think civil society can play in that process? And what tactics, either local prosecution, development, or something else, do you see as most beneficial?
So I think that's a really good question, and this is a very difficult situation, obviously. How do you deal with, an influx of people who are coming from a place that was controlled by ISIS and you don't know who is who? At the same time, I think civil society can play a really important role in terms of ensuring that people's rights are protected in detention, in trial. I just recently read an article about, several hundred detainees in Dahuk who are being appointed lawyers to represent them, which is great, but what's the quality of representation? Do they have the resources that they need? And so some sort of oversight into what's going on in that process. Are people able to sit through those trials and see if they're able to put on evidence, if they're able to really put on a full defense? What's happening with juveniles? Are they being tried in juvenile court as opposed to an adult court? So there's a lot of sort of questions, and I think role that civil society has to play in ensuring that those rights are guaranteed and that there's some oversight.
Yeah, I think as Sherizan said, that this is very interesting. If you put yourself in the position of like a security forces, and then these people being lived in under the ISIS for like, I don't know, 2 years, somehow 3 years, and now they're fleeing. So you will suspect there is something going on there. You will kind of screen them, but I will add to what Sherizan said. I think civil society here could play a big role in providing the right legal services to kind of represent these people. Provide like a kind of special legal environment for these people to be screened or to be, I would say, taken care of. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bayan Sami Abdurrahman, the Kurdistan Regional Government representative to the United States. I'd like to thank yourself, Nawaf and Sherizan, for your presentation and for pointing out the important role of civil society in Kurdistan. NGOs, civil society organizations have affected real change that has improved lives, and I don't think any of us should forget that. There's one thing that I would like to point out, and then I do have a question. I think it's really important to remember the kind of pressure that the Kurdistan region is under today, economically, in terms of security challenges, in terms of our healthcare. The host community is impacted, the displaced community is impacted. Our population has increased by 30% in a very short period of time. And I think all of us who live in DC, let's imagine if DC's population increased by 30% in a very short period of time, and how the civil society, the healthcare system, the education system in Washington could cope with it, let alone in a region that is part of Iraq. And I think that context is crucial, because not only it impacts civil society, it impacts the displaced who are sometimes treated with suspicion because they were maybe with ISIS or under ISIS, but also it means that the KRG and the local organizations can't necessarily provide the real, service the real needs of the population. My question is really to take things forward. Mosul will be liberated very soon. There are some other areas that also need to be liberated, such as Hawija and Tel Afar. But let's assume that these are all liberated and ISIS as a caliphate has come to an end. what is the role of civil society in reconstruction and reconciliation, if ever there can be reconciliation? Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Ben, for important remarks. Yeah, I mean, as I touch on this base of economy and security, Kurdistan is being actually, under a big pressure, and that, I mean, even that was like a very difficult situation for civil society organizations to change their shifts from, they already put their plans and propose, and now this, group of people coming being increased. That's to some certain civil society has done, a great job in addressing some of their issues. So when it comes to, I will comment really on the, the liberation, after the liberation of this, what we call it right now, the post-ISIS era or post-ISIL era or period. I will compare the situation in Tel Afar and the rest of, the Nineveh or the disputed territories to where I came from, Sinjar. So in Sinjar, for example, how you do, that's a big question, and many of the civil society organizations, how you do the reconciliation between a Yazidi who was betrayed by his neighbor, whose daughter and his women was taken by his neighbor. So how you do that? That's a very tough situation to put yourself. I've been in the, civil society organization, they will like how to manage conflicts, how to push for the, to the reconciliation thing between the different groups and different minorities. And they face a lot of problems. They run a whole workshop for 2 days, and then they ended up disagreeing, taking photo with each other. So, imagine that sense of, and I don't think civil society in Kurdistan is ready to reconcile, even in the rest of Iraq, without a big push from international organizations. That's a big issue. I mean, one of the things, for example, if I'm being a victim of what happened to me, I would say, okay, I need I need justice. So who can bring me justice? Can civil society do that? I doubt that civil society in this situation, as you said, under these security circumstances and the economic circumstances in Kurdistan, they cannot give, they cannot do that. Thank you so much.
So thank you for your comment, and I'm glad that you pointed out just more about the context of what the situation is in Kurdistan, because I agree it's an incredibly difficult one. I first went to Kurdistan in 2005, and what I saw after 2014 is just a completely different place where so many people are just living in tents long-term with no sort of idea of when they can go back home or what their future looks like. And it's incredibly hard. It's a huge strain on local resources and the economy. And so it's an incredibly difficult operating environment. So I'm thankful to you for pointing that out. I think, I agree with Nawaf. This is an incredibly difficult situation that we're facing. And there are a lot of hard feelings. And I think the point that you raise, which is, can there be reconciliation? I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know how we can answer that. I think that's really, for these communities to answer, and looking sort of beyond civil society, or what you consider civil society. Are we talking about the tribes? Are we talking about religious leaders? What are the attitudes of these other groups that have power and influence in these communities, and what sort of role will they play? I would sort of put forward that in many ways, if you even look just historically at what's happened in Iraq, there has still not been reconciliation among the different groups, right? So people throughout the country don't have a shared understanding of what the history of the country is or what has happened to different groups. And so that hasn't happened, and now we're in a much worse situation. So not to sound so pessimistic, but I do think it's incredibly difficult. I guess I will say that maybe some room for work by civil society is in the camps where people are displaced and where people are trying to work with these communities to at least foster dialogue and some sort of understanding, and try to understand what people are willing to do, sort of what those red lines are. I mean, I think with the Yazidi community, you have a special sort of case where people have been so hurt and it's still ongoing and active. People are in captivity and people are still being abused. So you don't move beyond that easily. Other communities have suffered in different ways. And so are there areas for sort of making incremental changes, what does that look like? We've seen conflicts around the world where very horrible things have happened. So how have those, I think it would be important to look at how have those communities started to move forward, what worked, what didn't, and how might that be adapted to what's going on in Iraq. But, you know, I have no sort of expectation that that is necessarily going to happen easily or soon. I think it will take time.
Thank you. This gentleman has been very patient, and then we'll turn to this side of the room.
Thank you. Akil Abbas, American University of Iraq, Soli. Thank you, Nawaf, for a very informative presentation. My question is about the Yazidis returning to Shingal Sinjar. I've heard assessments from people on the ground, people who worked on this issue, even media reports, basically saying that there's a basic breakdown in trust between Yazidis and the reigning authorities in the region. I mean, the Yazidis have been basically let down by Baghdad, by Erbil, by their immediate neighbors, everybody. It's really a tragic story. And there is no sense of safety that they can return and stay. I'm not talking about logistical security, political issues, but the connection to the land, to this ancestral land, okay, is emotionally there, but the overwhelming desire is to migrate. Is this a lost cause? Are we seeing the end of Yazidis as a major, you know, concentration in Sinjar Shingal as part of that land? Are we seeing this community departing? And if that is the case, is civil society doing something to change this, or are we just counting the time? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Akil Abbas. Actually, Akil was my teacher at the American University in Iraq. Yeah. So, yeah, I think this is, I mean, one of the most important questions I had. I can say, I mean, as a citizen, I will talk as a citizen, somebody normal from Sinjar, come from a rural area, from farm. At the same time, as I will talk as an analyst and a civil society activist. So I'll give you two answers. So as a citizen, somebody who come from farms, the answer to question, yes. I mean, could be an end of like a minority like Yazidi and Christians. I mean, we already found since 2014, I would say 100,000 Yazidi. I will give you my family example. We were like, I'm one of the 10 siblings. And we were all living in Sinjar, but now I have 2 brothers, 1 sister in Germany. Part of my family here in Lincoln, I'm here. I have a brother in Holland with his wife, a brother in Greece, and I have my parents in Iraq. So you see, this is one example of the Yazidi family. Would I ever return to that area? If I got the right to be here, I may not. And that's in the case of everybody. That's my opinion as somebody come from that area. But as an activist, I will be more optimistic about that. Yeah. Unfortunately, despite what happened to Sinjar people, to Yazidi, I mean, not just Yazidi, Shia and Sunnis, everybody there, we have not seen a lot of collaboration between different political parties and different government. So, for example, I mean, Baghdad and KRG government, KRG, the Kurdish government, are still being an area of disputed territories. So there is not. And then civil society, sadly, is looking at the political party to do something. I mean, civil society can mediate, as I said, play that role of mediation. Okay, let's do something for these people. It has not been a priority to stabilize that area. So I will give you maybe you're familiar with the kind of a joke that we call this area the area between Hana and Mana. So the jokes goes like this. So they said a guy in his middle age, his 50s, he didn't have any kids. This is like a kind of Arabic joke. And he had an old wife, and he said, okay, I will get married. And then he married a very young, beautiful lady. And because half of his hair was, white, the other half was black. So when he go to sleep with the old wife, she will take all the, black hairs to make him look older, so he fits with her. And then when he goes to the youngest one, she will take out the white one so he could look younger. So he ended up with no hair. And people are like, what happened? People are asking him around, have you been diseased or something? He said, no, I'm stuck between Hana and Mana. So that's actually very, a very, like a joke about what's happening in disputed territories. Okay, and thank you.
Yes, I'm Mary Oak Smith, and I'm retired from the World Bank, and I launched a foundation for Iraqi women in 2007. And I understand that there is a gender development center. It's really a question for both of you. Sherazan, it's your topic, but I know about Nawaf's educational background, so I think it pertains to both. I understand there's a gender development center under development at AUIS, American University of Iraq in Soleimani. Are you aware of this? And if so, can you comment on it? And do you have any particular recommendations that they should take under advisement?
So thank you for that question. I know Choman Hardy, who is trying to launch this center, and she's an excellent scholar on gender and sort of, issues in Kurdistan and the wider Middle East. I think it's a great initiative. I think it's really important to be able to foster scholarship and learning in academia around gender issues. It's not something that really exists right now. At that level, and I think it's really important because oftentimes also what you see is a lot of civil society organizations working on these issues, but sort of lacking an understanding of the underlying, theory that informs a lot of the work that they do. And I think that can negatively impact how the work is done. So this center, I think, is a good way of sort of getting people to really talk about, well, why do these issues exist? What do scholars say? And really sort of study these issues and have that be part of the conversation instead of just sort of identifying what are the problems and what are we going to do about it, go deeper and try to understand, what are the underlying root causes and how does that manifest here and how do we want to deal with it here specifically. So I am aware of that initiative and I think it's a good one.
Thank you. Okay, Michael Allen in the back, and then we'll come forward. Just check to make sure that the microphone is on. It hasn't been sounding very loud.
Thank you. Mike Allen with the NED. I understand that Goran, or the Change Movement, has come out in opposition to the referendum, holding of the referendum in September. Can you explain the rationale behind that decision, why they are opposed to the referendum, and do you think that decision is likely to impact the turnout and therefore the legitimacy of the referendum when it's held?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I mean, somehow I wouldn't say I'm expert in analyzing the politics in the Kurdistan, but we see since Goran being I would say kicked out from the parliamentary since 2015 or 2014, they have become a kind of opposition to whatever going on in the parliamentary. And it was obvious for them to, we expected that for them to come as opposite to the idea of a referendum. Because I think Goran sees as a more of like a PUK KDP political achievement party rather than a people achievement. That's the argument they use it, I mean, here on this ground. So that's where I was talking about, you know, the role of civil society. I mean, Goran is not kind of explaining why they are against that. And they say, I read an article yesterday, I think there's by one of them, like Goran supporter, they said the independence on an empty stomach, which is referred to the economic crisis and, you know, all the other issues that going on. Referendum is like a game to take the attention away from. That's the argument, they use it. But can they go to that table? I think there have been some initiatives there, but I don't know how much that, you know, agreement will go or what is happening. But to my understanding, they are kind of like opposing to that thing. Thank you.
Okay, there's a hand here. Can I see a show of hands of who also would like to ask questions? Someone in the back.
Hi, thank you so much. Adele Nazarian with Breitbart News. As a follow-up to that question, I actually heard from certain government entities that their main concern with the referendum is that the Islamic State has not yet been depleted and destroyed, taken out. That's their concern. Do you think that if the Kurdish people do achieve a referendum vote, they will be able to contain and drive out the Islamic State on their own?
I don't know if I get the question exactly. Yeah.
Maybe try one more time.
Yeah.
Could you explain?
Yeah.
Yes, sure.
My apologies.
No, it's okay.
So he spoke about how certain people have expressed concern over the referendum vote. Empty stomachs, as you said, may have been the issue. Some others have come out and stated that their concern is the Islamic State, ISIS, has not yet been driven out of parts of the Kurdistan regions. And that's their concern. They kind of wanted to wait for the referendum to take place after ISIS has been destroyed.
Okay.
So I guess, what do you think? Do you think that even if they get the referendum vote and the independence, they'll be able to function and defeat ISIS? Or is it better for them to still be under the Iraqi kind of?
Okay. I think thank you so much. Thank you for repeating also. I think the question of like ending ISIS, most of the people would think it's ISIS being toward the end, you know, as a military group. We don't know about the ideology of it, you know, that maybe it may stay, it may, you know, give a birth to another ISIS, we don't know. But that's actually been an argument. And so that argument can actually brought to the table more by like coalition forces and in more international. I would say would like to connect to the previous question, to connect to Goran. Maybe Goran is not concerned. I mean, the refusion from inside Kurdistan, maybe it's not concerned about what would happen after ISIS. Some people, like for the minorities and things, like minority people from Yazidi, from Sunni, they are concerned about that issue, that your question, that ISIS not being ended and they cannot go to their areas and freely give their voice to, if the disputed territories were included within the referendum. Thank you.
Thank you for a very informative discussion. My name is Frini, and I'm an intern here at NED. And my question is also related to regional stability and political relations and balance of power. So Turkey characterized the referendum as a very big mistake, but it's the country that provides support for the Kurdish regional government in Iraq. So my question would be, do you think that they will try to influence the outcome of the referendum? And can the civil society mitigate and try to kind of bridge that hostility that the Turkish government brings in the States? Thank you.
Thank you. I was trying to do my best to avoid that question about Turkey, but somebody brought up. Yeah, if we look at the historical relationship between Kurdistan and Turkey, Turkey has their own concern about the Kurdish people living in their land. They always kind of been supportive of the Kurdish issue, but when it's come to the real actions, they take back that step. And that, I think, Bayan should be very, informative about this thing, because that's happened in 1990s, where, when Halabja was, the Anfal and the other things, Kurdish were bombarded by Saddam Hussein, the regime in Iraq. Turkey kind of blocked their borders, even they were like supportive of the Kurdish issue on some certain. So they have their concern on their own ground, I think. And I don't think, that's beyond the capacity of local civil society, and maybe beyond the capacity of international. It should be like more of like, political pressure and governmental pressure, even from government like US and, EU. And so that's the issue with the Turkey. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, in the back we have two. This gentleman here, and then in the very back.
Stanley Kober. On the Kurdistan regional referendum for independence, the United States declared independence. Our declaration of independence was, in effect, our first declaration of war. It was the second bloodiest war in our history on a per capita basis. Only the Civil War was worse. Relations with Turkey have just been mentioned. Baghdad has also expressed opposition. Iranian government has expressed opposition. What do you think will happen after the referendum, and what do you expect from the United States?
Yeah, thank you. As I said, it's a very big political questions, but I will try my best. Yeah. As you said, I mean, all these different governments and, going kind of not optimistic with the idea of referendum. Each one of them, just like Turkey, like Iran has its own concern. Iraq's kind of is a violation to our Iraqi constitution. And, still the I would say United States administrative believe in like one unified Iraq. So I think the insistence by the president of Kurdistan so far, I just wrote an article, interview with him on the France 22. There's a big insist on on the holding the referendum. And that's a tough decision by I would say the Kurdish government to do that and lose all these allies. I think that's happened. It's in you back read to the Kurdistan history with the, when the rule of British, that's also happened. So I mean, to give you a clear answer what will happen if the referendum were held. I mean, some people, they say referendum will not just change anything. It's just to use it, the result of referendum as a leverage to put, a way to put more pressure on Baghdad and use it as a negotiation tool with Baghdad. Some people, some political analysts, they analyze that way. So I hope I answered your question.
A word from Sharon.
I would just add, so these are really obviously difficult questions, and I think jumping into the politics of regional stability and what's going to happen is kind of a minefield. But I want to sort of bring it back to the issue of civil society, right? How does that sort of factor into what we're seeing? And I think one of the concerns is that everything is becoming so increasingly militarized, and that's not the function of civil society. So can civil society, the civil society that's been built up over more than 20 years in Kurdistan, can they survive these pressures to sort of focus more and more on either humanitarian response without focusing on sort of developing the society more, or what happens if if you don't have money, you're not going to be able to do the work, or you're going to be able to do much less of it. So what happens when interest from the international community sort of wanes, so that most of the funding that is now being funneled into civil society starts to sort of draw down? Before ISIS took Mosul in 2014, that's what was happening. A lot of the funding was starting to dry up. USAID said we're finished working in Iraq, and so, you know, people were sort of turning their focus away from a lot of the work that was being done. So what does that mean for the future for civil society to continue to address the kinds of issues that they think are important when everything is increasingly focused on war and conflict, and people are just sort of struggling to survive under very difficult circumstances, and then civil society is struggling to meet the needs under incredibly difficult circumstances. So I just sort of wanted to draw it back to that, because they're operating in a really complicated, difficult environment, and I think it just puts a lot of pressure on them, and I think we should really focus on sustainability. What happens if the funding does dry up? How do these organizations then continue to work and continue to be supported?
I think we have time for, well, there's two hands, and Arthur, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, but I can surrender because
Two last questions then, back.
Hi, my name is Stanley Courier. I think this is a little bit more of a softball question, and it actually just addresses what you brought up. I was curious in terms of what local civil society organizations, maybe on their own or with international organizations, are doing to support youth in terms of helping to build skills whereby they can, you know, perhaps have their own income streams or to encourage their economic livelihood. If you have a sense of kind of what's going on the ground now, I'd be very interested in hearing that. Thank you.
yeah. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot, Nawaf, for really a fantastic presentation, which has elicited a lot of debate. I didn't think that your fellowship was this difficult, but it's clearly very hard. And I think your location as a person, you know, like identifying yourself as part of the context, I think is very, very crucial. And therefore, some of the things you've done in the past about engaging with young people, trying to deal with issues of the mind, I think they should continue. How you do it, I don't know, but it has to happen. Secondly, that was just a comment. Secondly, it's really a question about civil society tends to focus on manifestations oftentimes, not the real structural problems. I think unless civil society deal with the structural issues, which often is about power, how is power acquired, used, and reproduced? I think you can have civil society in perpetuity, but without really resolving the big questions that are being asked. So what, in your view, do you see as impulses within civil society to deal with these deeper structural political questions, for which manifestations, you know, you can deal with humanitarian and whatever it is. So I think that is crucial. Even if it's just about debate, it's very, very important. Secondly, what lessons do you think can be drawn from other contexts, not just other countries, but other contexts? Because if you think about some of the difficult questions around transitional justice, truth and reconciliation, there have been many examples all over the world. Do you think you can actually spend some time reflecting on doing a mapping of where these difficult situations have been handled? I mean, contexts are always so diverse, but there is always opportunity to learn from other contexts. I think if this is an area you're interested in, you could draw some comparisons that could give you some ideas, not a blueprint, but some ideas about how civil society could engage with these issues. Thank you very much.
lessons that you would want to
Yeah,
suggest?
yeah, there are, I mean, I think there are quite a lot of youth-focused programs in terms of building skills and capacity, and I think that that is definitely worth investing in. I think the question that you raised about just structural problems and within, I think, I don't know if you were focusing on structural problems internally within civil society organizations and sort of looking to hold larger structural institutions accountable. I definitely think there's a lot of work that can be done within civil society organizations in some ways, not necessarily before, but also in tandem with looking at the larger community. So you have, again, one of the things that I mentioned was this very sort of hierarchical society that is also very patriarchal. And you find that within family institutions, you find that practice within civil society institutions, and you find it practiced at the public level within government institutions. And so what is it going to take to sort of change a lot of the attitudes and beliefs that are not so easy to transform? I think there has to be a lot of sort of reckoning internally also for organizations to be able to, I think, improve and strengthen how they work and function and their own structural issues while they're also sort of looking externally. So.
Thank you. Nawaf, the last word or words.
Yeah. So I think the subject of youth is very interesting, and I personally have seen a lot of civic engagement by the youth, and as I also referred on my presentation, youth usually will use a civil society as a way to build their skills and their other thing, to until they ended up they discover themselves who they are, and to provide that environment for youth, it's very crucial by civil society to do that. In terms of like deeper, issues with that's going on, answering to Arthur's questions. As I said also, and I think Sherizan kind of touched that area. Civil society, local civil society, if they want to be a healthy, functioning civil society, they should go beyond. I would say that also I recommend that for the international, they go beyond the technical support, beyond the writing a proposal, creating a website. They should do more of like question their structure. Many civil society organizations, although the hierarchical, all the key decision made by one person, and that's affecting the rest of the staff within the civil society. I think, politically, like in terms of a diverse area, I think Tanzania's, a good example, like if you compare it in the term of tribal and different people, and they kind of succeed in building their own state. So that one will be the case. And I would say I would look at the civil society in Eastern Europe, even different contexts and different, geographically, but that will be also interesting to look at it. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us. I think we have a most impressive fellow in Nawaf. Thank you for your support for U.S. troops and for coming and continuing your work here in the United States with your wife, along with family and friends who have supported you. They're here today. And also to Sheranaz for your work, so impressive, and your articulate discussion of the role of women and how they are managing now in Iraq. So thank you all for coming, and a round of applause, please.